We're following the latest on the Texas primary elections, where there's been a shift towards a Democratic voter turnout. More than 1 million Democrats voted in yesterday's races.
Texas hasn't seen that level of turnout in a midterm primary since 2002. However, to put this all in context, these voter turnout levels are still substantially lower than Republicans, who still cast more ballots. This is still Texas.
That's right.
A Washington Post reporter, Mike DeBonis, is following the latest from Capitol Hill. So, Mike, what are the biggest highlights and takeaways from the nation's first primary of the year?
As you mentioned, you've seen Democrats turn out in much bigger numbers in Texas than they have in recent midterm cycles. There's no doubt about that. But there is there was a bit of a reality check last night for Democrats statewide. You still saw Republicans cast 500,000 more votes than Democrats did in those statewide races. I think that sort of tempered hopes that they have of competing in some of the statewide races, in particular the Senate seat that's now held by Ted Cruz. But on the flip side, there's clearly a big surge in more urban and suburban areas. These are places where Democrats are trying to take House seats away from Republicans, and I think that they have a lot of reason for optimism in those races.
Yeah, I mean, Mike, at the end of the day, Democrats were very optimistic, but they are always optimistic, at least in the last couple of election cycles. They've always been optimistic when it comes to Texas. And you wrote an article highlighting a quote from Senator Ted Cruz, and this is what he said. The good news is that there are a lot more conservatives in Texas than there are liberals. And of course, soon after Senator Cruz won that primary, he released an attack ad on his eventual competitor, Beto O'Rourke. So the bottom line here is this. Is there a surge, in your estimation, in Texas of Democrats, or is it just wishful thinking on their part?
There's definitely a surge. The question is it a statewide phenomenon that can lift someone like Beto O'Rourke into a real competitive position in November, or is it more localized? Is it really going to manifest itself more in legislative races and in congressional races? Right now, I think you can say it's the latter more than the former. That definitely, if you're looking at Republican House seats potentially flipping, that's a definite possibility, perhaps even a probability at this point. But looking at those statewide races, it's still a Republican state. It's still very difficult to think that Ted Cruz doesn't have a very clear advantage over Congressman O'Rourke.
Well, and I want to ask you, Mike, because the congressman did raise a lot of money. And the fact, I guess, that Senator Cruz released that attack ad or that campaign ad so soon after the primary suggests that he is a little bit worried. On the other hand, I listened to, it was sort of a song, it was like a jingle that he wrote, and it was basically attacking Beto O'Rourke for changing his name.
Yes.
And there was a line in there about he's going to take away your guns. I mean, is that really still just sort of the line of argument that Republicans are saying,
and
that they think that liberals are going to take your guns away?
There is an irony with Ted Cruz making fun of someone else's name because, his given name is Raphael, and he clearly doesn't go by that.
But also the president used to call him Lion's Head. So there's that, too.
I think Ted Cruz is running a lot of races in Texas politics. I think that he has a sense of what works, particularly in terms of getting the Republican base out to vote, which is really a key part of his success. Talking about guns and gun control is a time-tested technique for Republican candidates in Texas. I think that's what you're seeing. You're right. The name calling. I think this is just an indication of how rowdy and potentially exciting this race is going to be. I think that if nothing else, I think that Congressman O'Rourke and Senator Cruz are going to have a very lively race over the next few months. And it's definitely one that's going to attract a lot of attention nationally.
So before you go, Mike, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk to you about the President Trump's economic advisor, Gary Cohens, leaving the White House. This is a huge deal. This is another defection, if you will, high-profile defection. What sort of impact do you think this is going to be having on the administration?
Well, I can tell you that as a congressional reporter, there's just a huge amount of concern fairly quiet concern at this point among Republicans here on Capitol Hill about what is going on in the White House. Gary Cohn was seen as a moderating influence on the president, sort of able to talk him out of the more rash moves. But now you've seen with this tariffs decision that's being viewed here on Capitol Hill by Speaker Ryan and a whole bunch of other Republicans as a terribly rash move that could have all sorts of negative impacts on the economy. You're just seeing huge concern, and the question up here is this going to ripple through other parts of the administration? Is it going to make it harder to recruit talented people to come to the White House? I think there's a lot of questions about who is going to replace Gary Cohn and who's going to play that role of being sort of the more moderate establishment, financial type of Republican, rather than the so-called economic nationalist sort of Republican who's going to be in the president's ear. And there's a lot of anxiety about that.
Mike, before we let you go, I just want to ask you, your colleague Dana Milbank wrote in the Washington Post about Gary Cohn's resignation in the wake of President Trump's suggestion over these tariffs, and specifically since you cover the Hill, Paul Ryan saying that he doesn't see eye to eye with the president on this, and it's a very rare sort of rebuke from Congressman Ryan to the president of the United States. And Dana writes that, this is after, and I'm quoting here, disparaging Mexican immigrants, videotape boasts about sexually assaulting women, alleging his predecessor put a wiretap on him, the firing of James Comey, talk of women bleeding, a payoff to a porn actress over an alleged affair. How does Speaker Ryan sort of address these concerns and sort of square that with just, hey, I'm finally coming out against the president over this one specific issue?
Well, listen, the Speaker Ryan's been trying to walk this fine line between, holding sort of true to his brand of Republican politics, which is more business-oriented, more about free markets and traditional Republican ideology, and, for lack of a better word, Trumpism. And it's clearly been a difficult task for him, and he's been forced to gently, repudiate the president on all of these occasions that you mentioned. What he's doing now is a direct challenge to the sort of Republican that Paul Ryan and a lot of his colleagues in the Republican Party consider themselves to be. It's taking on the whole notion of free markets. They consider, as far as Paul Ryan's concerned, a tariff is a tax. This is a tax hike, and he's a Republican who's against tax hikes. This is very fundamental, and I think it's perfectly sound to be pointing out, as Dana did in his column, that it should also be very fundamental when you're talking about matters of racial equality and all these other things. But I would point this out, which is that the Speaker has said he differs with the President on this, but he has not taken action yet. Congress could act to overturn these tariffs. It would be very difficult. It would involve passing a piece of legislation by veto-proof majorities, but as of now, there's no indication that Paul Ryan or any other Republican is going to pursue that course. We'll see how this plays out in the next few days and weeks.
It's very interesting. Mike DeBonis, thank you so much.
My pleasure.